This simple infinity, or the absolute notion, may be called the simple essence of life, the soul of the world, the universal blood whose omnipresence is neither disturbed nor interrupted by any difference, but rather is itself every difference and also their supersession. It pulsates within itself but does not move, inwardly vibrates, yet is at rest. It is self-identical, for the differences are tautological. They are differences that are none. This self-identical essence is therefore related only to itself. To itself implies a relationship to an other, and the relationship to self is rather a self-sundering. Or in other words, that very self-identicalness is an inner difference. These sundered moments are thus in and for themselves each an opposite of an other. Thus, in each moment, the other is at the same time expressed, or each is not the opposite of an other, but only a pure opposite, and so each is therefore in its own self the opposite of itself. In other words, it is not an opposite at all, but is purely for itself, a pure self-identical essence that has no difference in it. Accordingly, we do not need to ask the question, still less to think that fretting over such a question is philosophy, or even that it is a question philosophy cannot answer. The question, that is, how, from this pure essence, how does difference or otherness issue forth from it? For the division into two moments has already taken place. Difference is excluded from the self-identical and set apart from it. What was supposed to be the self-identical is thus already one of these two moments instead of being the absolute essence. That the self-identical divides itself into two means, therefore, just as well that it supersedes itself as already divided, supersedes itself as an otherness. The unity of which it is usual to say that difference cannot issue from it is in fact itself one of the two moments. It is the abstraction of the simplicity or unitary nature over against the difference. But in saying that the unity is an abstraction, that is only one of the opposed moments, it is already implied that it is the dividing of itself. For if the unity is a negative, is opposed to something, then it is eo ipso posited as that which has an antithesis within it. The different moments of self-sundering and becoming self-identical are therefore likewise only this movement of self-supersession. For since the self-identical, which is supposed first to sunder itself or become its opposite, is an abstraction or is already itself a sundered moment, its self-sundering is therefore a supersession of what is, and therefore the supersession of its dividedness. Its becoming self-identical is equally a self-sundering. What becomes identical with itself thereby opposes itself to its self-sundering. That is, it thereby puts itself on one side, or rather it becomes a sundered moment. Paragraph 162 is one of those sections in which Hegel is going to begin by raising your hopes rather high. Wow, we've finally gotten to the real meat of this. He's talked a lot about the entire inner world, about how these supersensible and sensible worlds are fused together and consciousness is there. You remember in previous sections we were always looking for the absolute, that which is greatest, that which is sort of unconditioned, lying behind the scenes. And we've gone through a lot of, twos and fros, finding out, well, this isn't it, this looks like it, but it's not it, because, we explore it, and it like unravels, and there's all these other things going on. Here, Hegel is going to start out by saying, this simple infinity, or the absolute notion, the absolute concept, the absolute Begriff, that's about as good as you can get, right? When you say absolute, that's what Hegel's all about, isn't it? And, the concept, put them together, wow, we've got like, plus sign plus a plus sign. So he says, this may be called the simple essence of life. Life is this, vast plethora of things that we can experience. We can only really experience a sliver of them because life is itself so fecund, so fertile. It takes, almost an infinite variety of forms for Hegel, as we've seen him talk about earlier, and as we're going to see him talk about later on. The soul of the world, that which is connecting everything together. This notion of the world soul is an old one, and it comes from Greek philosophy. It's particularly strong in the Stoics, who thought that a rationality ran through the entirety of finite, ultimately bounded, existence. Hegel is saying this absolute, that's what it is. the universal blood whose omnipresence is neither disturbed nor interrupted by any difference, but rather is itself every difference as their supersession, as is its supersession. This sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It's every one of the things and all of them bound up together. It's not just sort of a big pantheism of taking everything in or some sort of monism. It's even accounting for differences and their supersession and their Aufhebung, their overcoming, their sublation, however we want to translate that word. So, like I said, this sounds pretty promising. So, what can we say about this? When he moves to talking about this as self-identical essence, he says, it is self-identical, but for the differences are tautological. Now, Hegel actually uses the cognate term, tautologische, here. It's not just, Miller translating it in there. He's saying these differences are, in fact, these Unterschied, these splittings, these separations between things, are tautological. What does that mean? They're saying the same thing over and over again. They're sort of caught in a loop. So he says they're differences that are none. And we've seen this talked about quite a bit. Differences can only be differences that are genuine differences when they matter in some way. And the way that they tend to matter in the Hegelian dialectic is by moving us ahead somewhere or showing us how things are really contrasted to each other. Differences, you might say, become differences that matter when they're not merely differences, but oppositions or even contradictions. So he says, this self-identical essence is therefore only related to itself. So it looks like we've got this, bounded sphere, right? To itself, however, implies a relationship to an other. And the relation to itself is rather a self-sundering. So by the very virtue of this absolute, of this whole being what it is, being a self-identical essence, it already creates, it brings upon the scene alterity, you might say, as its sort of shadow. So he says, the relation to self, right, the relation to itself is a self-sundering. Or in other words, that very self-identicalness is an inner difference. So these sundered moments are thus in and for themselves each an opposite, right? And whether we think of it in terms of this side and shooting the other out, or now the other sort of assuming its priority, and we reflect on it and we realize that, this self-identical essence is really the other to this. We saw this dynamic play out with forces earlier, didn't we? In any case, we realize that they are each an opposite of another. So alterity, otherness, is inescapable. He says, each is not the opposite of another, but a pure opposite. This is another possibility. They can exist in their relation to each other, or they can try to separate themselves out and exist as pure beings, extrinsic to each other, unattached to each other, pure opposites. And he says, and so each is therefore in its own self the opposite of itself. In other words, it's not an opposite at all, but is purely for itself a pure self-identical essence that has no difference in it. These are all possibilities for this absolute, for this simple infinity. That is, as we've seen, manifest within the world. Not only the world of the supersensible, of what's really going on behind the scene, but the world that we're experiencing. Either it takes into account its other, and the fact that it is producing its other out of itself, or it ends up being less than what it is, less than what it can be. So he says, accordingly, we don't have to ask the question, or even worry about this whether such a question is philosophy, or even that it's a question philosophy cannot answer. He's saying something about method here to us, isn't he? The question, how from this pure essence, how does difference or otherness issue forth from it? Now, is Hegel saying, look, this just happens, really no explanation for it. No, he's not saying that here. He's not saying, you want to ask questions about that, sort of like Wittgenstein. I just need to let the fly out of the fly bottle. You're asking the wrong kind of question. You're committing, as Ryle would call it, a category mistake. Hegel's not saying that. What Hegel would actually say if he was pressed on that is, haven't you read the sections all the way leading up to this? What have we actually been developing for you? What have we been showing you? The necessity of this development. Why it works the way it does, where it comes from. So he says, for the division into two moments has already taken place. Difference is excluded from the self-identical and set apart from it. What was supposed to be the self-identical is thus already one of these two moments, instead of being the absolute essence. So we started out here. We have the self-identical essence. Then we realize that it others itself. It others itself to itself in the other, which has to be genuinely other to it. And now the self-identical unity isn't really the unity after all that we thought it was. Why not? Because it's already divided. He says, the unity, of which it is usual to say difference cannot issue from it, is in fact itself one of the two moments. So we can talk about unity in terms of unifying two moments, but then the unity itself is something else as opposed to either of the two moments or the both of them together. We saw this play itself out already in the dialectics that were involved in sense certainty and in perception, didn't we? Now we're seeing it play itself out here in a closer to the concept manner in terms of the way the understanding is making sense of it. So this simple infinity is really a unity which takes into account the self-identical essence that it is and its other that it also is and has to be and creates out of itself. So saying, we don't want this unity to lapse into a mere abstraction. He says, it is the abstraction of the simplicity or unitary nature over against the difference. But if we call this an abstraction that is only one of the opposed moments, it's already implied that it is the dividing of itself, right? That it is also self-othering. If the unity is a negative, is opposed to something, it's eo ipso, by that very fact, posited as that which has an antithesis within it. Here we have a key Hegelian notion, right? That within unity, it's not just pure self-same unity, sort of like a perfectly bounded sphere that nothing else can get in. It already contains dynamism, it already contains change, it already contains relation, it already contains antithesis within itself. So he says these different moments of self-sundering, of becoming self-identical, are likewise only this movement of self-supersession, of self-othering, of self-overcoming, of raising the self to a higher level. Since the self-identical, which is supposed first to sunder itself or become its opposite, is an abstraction or is already itself a sundered moment, its self-sundering is therefore a supersession of what it is, and therefore the supersession of this dividedness. So it's carrying out a supersession or sublation of its own sublation. It's doing it to the second power, you could say. So he says, it's becoming self-identical is equally as self-sundering. What becomes identical with itself thereby opposes itself to its self-sundering. So we have this constant tension going on, where a thing, in order to be what it is, in order to have its determinacy, even if we're talking about the whole, the absolute, has to self-sunder, has to split it from itself, has to break up into more than one. And then it has to figure out how these are going to be unified. And there's various possibilities here. It may misrecognize the unity as being, something that has to be turned into an abstraction, as opposed to all that, nonsense over there. It may misrecognize the other as something hostile, as something unimportant, as something it can set aside. If it does that, the dialectic is actually going to stop at that point for that person. As we're going to see, that's not what does happen in the play of consciousness that we're observing here in doing phenomenology. Infinity, or this absolute unrest of pure self-movement in which whatever is determined in one way or another, for example, as being, is rather the opposite of this determinateness. This, no doubt, has been from the start the soul of all that has gone before. But it is in the inner world that it is first freely and clearly shown itself. Appearance, or the play of forces, already displays it, but it is as an explanation that it first freely stands forth, and in being finally an object for consciousness as that which it is, consciousness is thus self-consciousness. The understanding's explanation is primarily only the description of what self-consciousness is. It supersedes the differences present in the law, differences which have already become pure differences, but are still indifferent, and it posits them in a single unity, in force. But this unifying of them is equally and immediately a sundering, for it supersedes the differences and posits the oneness of force only by creating a new difference, that of law and force, which, however, at the same time is no difference. And moreover, from the fact that this difference is no difference, it goes on to supersede this difference again, since it lets force be similarly constituted to law. But this movement, or necessity, is thus still a necessity and a movement of the understanding. Or the movement as such is not the understanding's object. On the contrary, in this movement, the understanding has as objects positive and negative electricity, distance, force of attraction, and 1,000 other things which constitute the content of the moments of the movement. The reason why explaining affords so much self-satisfaction is just because in it consciousness is, so to speak, communing directly with itself, enjoying only itself. Although it seems to be busy with something else, it is in fact occupied only with itself. In paragraph 163, which is the third to the end in this section of Force and the Understanding, Hegel is now bringing in a new term which is going to be the rubric for everything that's going to follow in the next section, self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein. That is, consciousness not only of an object as something that is other than myself, the conscious subject, but also an objectifying look at myself, an understanding of myself that turns myself into an object for consciousness, while at the same time being what is taking that perspective. So we're going to see a lot of development going on with self-consciousness. Here it's just sort of raising its head, but doing so in a very important way. A way that shows us that understanding itself is going to arrive at certain limits that consciousness must go beyond. So, he says, infinity, or this absolute unrest of pure self-movement, in which whatever is determined in one way or another, that, for example, as being, is rather the opposite of this determinateness. This, no doubt, has been from the start the soul of all that has gone before. So everything that we've been leading up to is this. Infinity is an absolute unrest, this constantly dynamic process that doesn't even, remain dynamic in just one direction, but veers off in all these different ways and then reincorporates itself. Pure self-movement in which determinate being over and over and over again in anything that is bestimmt, anything that is determined in one way or another, generates an opposite determinateness out of that. And then the question is, how is this reincorporated? How is this brought back together? And we've seen that this happens a number of ways. He now then talks about the inner world and appearance, or the world of appearance, and we have law and force, as we've seen throughout this entire section, as sort of mediating factors between them. The law, if we understand the law in terms of the inner being of things, is one thing. How it applies to all the particulars and appearance is another thing. As we go from what is less determinate and more abstract to what is more determinate, we move from the inner world to appearance. There's a question about how we actually reconcile all of these things. Same thing with force. There's this back and forth, this interplay between law and between force in its expression, force as it is in itself, force as it's diffused over all the moments of force, all the things that force is supposed to apply to, force as what it is. Force itself splits into two and then has to be reincorporated as we see. So he says, this, no doubt, has been from the start the soul of all that has gone before. It's in the inner world it has first freely and clearly shown itself. Why? Because in the inner world we're able to analyze what is really going on, or at least what we take to be really going on, with this world of appearances. There's a certain freedom involved and a necessity involved in moving to the inner world. So he says, appearance, or the play of forces, already displays it, but it is as explanation that it first freely stands forth. Now we've seen that this term explanation that Hegel has used before, he used in a somewhat pejorative way. And he's going to still retain some of those resonances here. Explanation is what the understanding generates for itself of things. It's a way for it to talk about these things as if it really knows them. He says, in being finally an object for consciousness as that which it is, consciousness is thus self-consciousness. That's kind of a leap, right? From talking about explanation to, self-consciousness as taking in the object for consciousness. Consciousness has been attending to the object for consciousness, whether we understand that as in terms of the appearances, with perception, with sense certainty, or these laws, these forces, law itself, force itself that it's trying to make sense of. Consciousness has been trying to make sense of this. It's been taking them as objects. Now, he says, in finally being an object for consciousness as that which it is, consciousness is thus self-consciousness. It is because I can say I am the one who is giving an explanation, or I want to know what the hell is going on, that I am a self-consciousness. In doing so, I am treating myself both as a subject and as an object. So here's where self-consciousness is first coming on the scene in a thematic way. So he says the understanding's explanation is primarily only the description of what self-consciousness is. Why? Why would that be the case? Isn't the understanding supposed to be about all this stuff outside of consciousness? Well, yes, but as it turns out, where is all that stuff? We've already seen this dialectic play itself out in the earlier sections on sense certainty and perception, haven't we? What is for consciousness also is in consciousness. This is where Hegel's idealism really becomes important. So explanation. The understanding's explanation is primarily, he says, only the description of what self-consciousness is. The understanding is explaining to itself what it is that is going on with all of this. And it's explaining to itself how it unpacks these concepts like law and force. So he says the understanding's explanation supersedes the differences present in the law, differences which have already become pure differences, posits them in a single unity and force, but this unifying of them is equally and immediately a sundering, for it supersedes the difference and posits the oneness of force only by creating a new difference, that between law and force. It looks like it's doing stuff with things that are totally outside of itself in this process, doesn't it? But really what it's doing is understanding how the understanding works in terms of law and force. That's why this is force and the understanding, because force is not without the understanding. It is consciousness which is bringing this to be. It is consciousness, which is uncovering this dialectic, this to and fro of othering and reconciliation or coming back together, of splitting into different moments. It's consciousness that's taking all this in, and it's consciousness that is representing this to itself as what consciousness is grasping. So he goes on and he says, this moment or necessity is thus still a necessity and movement of the understanding, or the movement as such is not the understanding's object. On the contrary, in this movement, the understanding has as objects all these things like positive and negative electricity, distance, force of attraction, all these things that we've talked about over here. 1,000 other things, he says, which constitute the content. Here's where he gets to something really interesting. Explanation is the understanding's way of making sense of the world, its environment, its experience, what it's talking about with other people. But really what explanation is doing is coming back to the understanding. The understanding is, as Hegel's going to say, explaining itself to itself. It is explaining what it is that it grasps. This is why explanation, he says, here he's talking about something affective, not just something cognitive, something affective. He says, the reason why explaining affords so much self-satisfaction. Now think about that for a second. Let me pause on that. We'll come back to that primary clause of the sentence. Isn't it fun to explain stuff? I mean, what are we doing here right now? I'm actually enjoying explaining the movements in Hegel's book to you. You're probably, not just passively absorbing this, but taking some notes, trying to think of how, what would be some examples of this? How does all this apply? Where can we go further with this? You're engaging in the process of explanation as well. It is quite fun. It is enjoyable. There's a satisfaction involved in it. Satisfaction of what? As we're going to see later on, a satisfaction of desire. So, the reason why explaining affords so much self-satisfaction is just because in it, he says, consciousness is communing directly with itself. We appear to be talking about all this stuff out here, but what we're really doing is talking with ourselves, using those things as kind of props. So the primary relation is really that of the person or the subject or consciousness, self-consciousness, with itself through these things and also through the understanding. He says, consciousness is, so to speak, communing directly with itself, enjoying only itself. Although it seems to be busy with something else, it is in fact occupied only with itself. How do I conceptualize the world? I can say that in terms of how do I conceptualize the world? All that stuff over there. Or how do I conceptualize, concepts are me, the world. Hegel is producing what in language I just produced by a difference of emphasis. He's producing that sort of shift in this section here. This is prepping us to move into the next main section.